Well, thank you very much. And can I say, it's been an absolute joy to be here this week and to speak at these events. And I hope you've enjoyed the last 3 nights for those of you who have been here for the entire week. And if you've only arrived tonight, I'm sorry you did miss out. Although it's not quite the end, and we'll tell you at the end about something that's happening after this week is finished. But I think it would be worth just pausing for a second, because there are a lot of people who've put a load of work into this week, and I think you'll agree it's been fantastic. So can we just, for all of those who've been involved in different ways, say a massive thank you? Well, all week we've been looking at these big questions of life, and tonight's question is pretty big. The question, is there more to life than this? Is this all there is? It's a big question that we're looking at. It's actually really a question about death, isn't it? Is there something beyond death? We didn't put death in the title because we thought that would be a pretty negative word to kind of encourage people to come to an event. Because actually, we don't think about death a lot, do we? If you want to ruin a really good party, here's how you do it. Walk into the middle and say, hey guys, have you thought about your death lately? It's absolutely guaranteed to make it go badly. People do joke about death, of course. Woody Allen put it this way. He said, I'm not afraid to die. I just don't want to be there when it happens. And you can kind of understand what he's saying. But why is it that we don't think about death and what lies beyond? Maybe it's because even though we are so advanced in many ways and have so many things, in our Western culture we still don't seem to have an answer to the biggest problem of all, death. And yet the statistics haven't changed, have they? 1 out of 1 people die. It will happen to all of us at some point. So it's probably worth thinking about this question. Is there something beyond death? Is this all there is? Now, of course, some people would say, no, there is nothing beyond death. This life is all there is. And maybe that was the philosophy behind this short advert. Again, sorry, the sound won't work, but you don't really need the sound, and maybe you'll be glad that you don't have it. But this was an advert, I won't tell you what for, that was on British television. It only lasted about a week before it got banned. You'll see why, don't worry, it's not explicit. But here goes. Life is short, play more, Xbox. But that kind of sums up the philosophy of many people, isn't it? This is all we've got, live it up, because when you die, you're dead, and that's it. So enjoy life now. And I kind of get what people are on about, but actually if you think about it, if this life is all there is, then how can you just get on and enjoy life and play? I mean, if this life is all there is, what's the point of everything we do and we achieve? Because ultimately it will count for nothing. All of our achievements in education, in sports, in environment, in everything will be destroyed. And so actually the philosophers who have thought about this most deeply have come to the conclusion that if this life is all there is, then life is very, very depressing and it's utterly pointless. But actually, how do we know that this life is all there is? Well, someone once put it this way. They said, we know that there's nothing when you die because I asked a dead person what happened and they said, nothing. But that's probably not a very complex way of trying to find out. Now, the problem is with this question is that none of us are dead, right? At least last time I checked, most of you look pretty alive. And so none of us are qualified. We stand on this side of that great event. And so we can guess at best, but we have no idea from our own experience about what will happen beyond it. What we'd need is for someone more qualified than us, right? A few years ago, I was in South Africa, and I went to this point, Cape Point, the most southwesterly point of the African continent. And up until 500 years ago, no one had been from Europe beyond this point and back again. Many had tried, everyone had failed, and many of them had died in the dangerous waters around this particular place. And so it used to be called the Cape of Storms. But then a Portuguese sailor called Vasco da Gama set off down the coast of Africa, all the way beyond this point to India and then back again. And as a result, they changed the name of this particular place from what it was called, the Cape of Storms, to what it's now called, the Cape of Good Hope. Because someone had gone beyond it and had come back from the other side to say what lay beyond. Now, right at the heart of the Christian claim is this: there is one person in all of history that is qualified to do that with death, because there's one person that's gone beyond death and has come back from the cold. No prizes for guessing who I'm talking about. Of course, we're talking about the claim of Jesus. There is one person, Christians claim, who has come back from death. Now, the only problem when I make that claim is that for many of us, we kind of say, but how do I know that it happened? How do I know that actually happened and isn't just a fairy story? So what I want us to do just for a few minutes is to look at the evidence for that claim tonight, because I don't want to believe things that aren't true, and I'm sure you don't either. What is the evidence for this outrageously big claim of Jesus' resurrection? And what may surprise you tonight is that even amongst scholars who are not Christians, scholars who are Jewish or atheist or others, there is an agreement that certain things must have happened. 5 facts that are really indisputable around this particular claim. Look at them quickly. Number 1, Jesus was crucified. It's not just written in the Bible, but in other secular sources. It's one of the most attested facts of antiquity. Secondly, the tomb was empty. In fact, Christianity couldn't have begun if the tomb wasn't empty. It wouldn't have got started. And also, there's an interesting point that in the biography accounts of Jesus, the first witnesses of this event are always recorded as being women. Now, in the first century, women were not regarded as being a reliable witness in a court of law. We obviously know better these days, but in that culture, that wasn't seen as being that way. And so if you were making up a story, why would you make up the biggest witnesses of the biggest event to be people who wouldn't have been regarded as reliable? Unless, of course, that was authentic. Number 3, the disciples of Jesus were convinced they had met him after this event. In fact, they were willing to die for that very belief, and many of them did. Number 4, their lives were transformed by this belief in the resurrection. They went from timid and scared disciples hiding in a locked room to bold witnesses of this event who turned the Roman world upside down. And then number 5, the Christian movement exploded with growth after this event. So within 20 years, the Roman historian Tacitus says that Christianity had got as far as Rome, and numerous people had become part of this movement. At a time when all of the evidence was available and all of the eyewitnesses were still alive. So those are 5 pieces of evidence. And remember what I said at the beginning. Amongst scholars, Christian, non-Christian, secular or whatever, there's generally agreement that these things must have happened. And so the question we want to ask is this: how do we make sense of that evidence? What explanation can you give that will explain that evidence satisfactorily? And actually, throughout the last few hundred years, only 5 different explanations have really been given. And if you can think of a better explanation or a different one, you know the address. Go to the website And you tell us, and we'll look at it later. What are the alternatives? How do we explain the evidence? Well, the first explanation some people give is that Jesus didn't actually die. In fact, in Islamic thoughts, the idea is that Jesus didn't die on the cross. It's written in the Quran, and that is a commonly held belief. Only issue with that is that there's no contemporary evidence to corroborate that. The earliest claim of that is actually from at least a couple of hundred years after the event. Other people say, well, maybe what happened is Jesus was put on the cross. He did get crucified, but he didn't actually die. Like, he just kind of swooned, passed out, revived in the cool of the tomb, and then people mistook him for being risen from the dead. Problem with that is that we know that the Roman soldiers were good at killing people. I mean, they did it for a living, and if they didn't do it properly, their life was to be killed instead of the person who should have been killed. And we also know that when Jesus was taken off the cross, he was passed between many loving hands who would have had to look and would have probably noticed if he was still alive. But the biggest issue is try and imagine what would have happened if Jesus was, in fact, not actually dead. He's taken off the cross, just in a kind of state of unconsciousness. He's wrapped in meters and meters and meters of burial cloths. He's placed in a tomb, and a large weighted stone is rolled away in the entrance. And then 3 days later, Jesus sits up in the tomb and revives. And then he has to unravel himself from all the burial cloths. And then he has to ravel them all up again and put them on the side. And then he has to push away this massive stone and run past the Roman guards, wash off the blood in the nearest river, and then appears to his disciples in a locked room and says, "Guys, I've conquered death." Now, the reality is anyone who had been crucified with nails in his hands and his feet wouldn't have been able to walk, let alone do anything like that 3 days later. It's just not going to happen. So here's the second alternative. The women went to the wrong tomb. In fact, someone said to me recently, they said, well, they were women after all, and they're not good at directions. That's what they said, not me. The blokes are even worse with directions, trust me. But actually, think about it. Let's think about it. Did the women go to the wrong tomb? Well, for a start, you don't normally forget where you bury people, do you? If you've ever had to do that, you will remember. And secondly, they all would have had to go to the wrong tomb every single time. But more importantly, why didn't someone point out the fact that they'd gone to the wrong tomb when they started thinking that Jesus was alive? I mean, just imagine a few weeks later, Peter, one of Jesus' followers, stands up in Jerusalem, the very city where this happened, and says, "Ladies and gentlemen, Jesus, who you crucified, is alive, his tomb is empty, and we have met him." And someone at the back of the crowd would have said, "Excuse me, yeah? I think you went to the wrong tomb, Peter. That's Uncle John's tomb, and they took his body away a few months ago. Jesus' tomb is down that road, you idiots." And everyone would have had a good laugh, the Christians would have looked very stupid, and the whole thing would have ended there and then. No, they didn't go to the wrong tomb. And remember, it wasn't just an empty tomb we're dealing with, it's the appearances of Jesus we have to explain too. Number 3, was the body moved? Well, by who, you might ask? By robbers? Well, why would grave robbers risk their lives to go and steal the naked body of a penniless preacher? I mean, there's not much to gain for that. Secondly, you might say, well, could the authorities have done it? They would have had access to the body, but why would they have wanted to do it? And if they had, why didn't they produce the body when people started wrongly thinking that Jesus had risen from the dead? Or perhaps the most likely candidates are the disciples, right? Maybe they snuck in, stole the body, and hid it in some attic whilst they told the world that Jesus was alive. Well, for a start, the disciples didn't seem to be expecting the resurrection to happen. But more importantly, remember, as I said a moment ago, all of them were willing to die for this belief, and many of them did. Now, it is true that sometimes people will die for things that aren't true. But people don't normally die for things that they know are not true, and if they'd stolen the body, they would have known this whole thing was a hoax. I mean, think about it. When I was a child, I used to make up stories to get myself out of trouble. I used to say things like, my sister did it, or the dog ate it, or it was already on fire when I arrived. Those kind of excuses to get myself out of trouble. But I never made up a story to get myself into trouble. So why on earth would these disciples make up this whole concocted story when they knew that it was going to put their lives in danger? They had nothing to gain from it if it wasn't true. So I don't think the body was moved. What about the fourth option? Were the disciples hallucinating? Maybe they just thought they had seen Jesus, but actually it wasn't Jesus at all. Well, the problem with that is that hallucinations, though they do happen, normally happen to certain types of people. They almost always happen to individuals on their own, and they normally have a destructive impact upon their mental health. But actually, these appearances of Jesus happen to all sorts of different types of people, sometimes up to 500 of them at the same time. And rather than having a destructive impact upon their mental health, it turned them into confident and bold people that transform the world. So psychologists say hallucinations cannot really explain what is going on here. And remember, it's more than just that. There's still an empty tomb to come to terms with. So here's the fifth option, and it's this. Jesus rose from the dead. Now, as ridiculous as that might sound at first, what I've discovered is this: in comparison with the alternatives, it's the only one that really makes sense, that fits the evidence. Now, I know some of you might say, well, hang on a minute. I'm an intelligent 21st century student here at the University of Oulu, and I just cannot believe that something like the resurrection could happen. I mean, it's supernatural, it's ridiculous, I just can't believe it, because miracles do not happen. Now, I fully appreciate that may be our start points. But to reject all of this on the basis of your presupposition, I think would be a mistake. You know why? Because normally in any kind of scientific study, we're willing to change our presuppositions if the evidence points another direction. And it would be very closed-minded to say, actually, no matter what the evidence says, I'm going to reject it because of what I've already assumed can or cannot happen. And if the evidence is compelling, then maybe we need to change our assumptions about what is or isn't possible in line with it. See, actually, I think the evidence of the resurrection is compelling. In fact, there isn't a book in the history of the last 2,000 years written by a lawyer or someone in the legal profession giving any explanation for the resurrection other than this. In fact, there are some books written by lawyers who wanted to do that, but as they looked into the evidence, they found it so compelling they changed their minds. So I really encourage you to do that. But you might ask this question, well, so what? Why does it really matter? What difference does it make if this is true? This event 2,000 years ago, how does that affect life? Can I briefly give you 4 reasons why I think this really does? Why does it matter? Firstly, because it means the future is certain. See, if Jesus rose from the dead, then actually this life is not all there is. And we've got evidence to show us that is the case. And so it's worth thinking about what lies beyond. In fact, one of the early followers of Jesus in the city of Athens, a few years after this event, stood up and he gave an address to a group of philosophers. And he finished his address by saying these words. He says, God has set a day when one day he will judge the world, and he's given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. He says one day there's going to be a judge that all of history is going to stand before, and that judge is the one who rose from the dead. In other words, it's Jesus. So he's saying actually one day every one of us will give an account before Jesus the judge. If that's true, it's probably worth thinking about, isn't it? The problem is sometimes we don't think about it. I mean, let me illustrate. A few years ago, I was driving to a different part of England. I was going to speak at a meeting, and I was going down the main highway, and I was driving along at what I thought was the speed limit, 70 miles per hour. And I was going along came round a corner under a bridge, and I saw a policeman pointing a gun at me. A speed gun, sorry, not a real gun. Our police aren't that extreme. Yeah, you speed, we shoot you. No, so they had this speed gun, and they're pointing it at me, and I'm thinking to myself, like, well, it's fine. Like, I'm keeping the speed limit. Everything's okay. And then I look to the left of the policeman, and there's this big red circle and the number 50 in the middle of it. And I think to myself, okay, I'm not okay. Hadn't realized the speed limit had dropped. And by this point, of course, I'm now like past the policeman, and I'm a few hundred meters down the road. And I look in my mirror and hope that maybe he's just kind of like missed me, like I'm invisible or something. But sadly, I see him pulling out into the road behind me and putting his blue flashing lights on. But of course, by this point, I'm a few more hundred meters down the road. So I have to confess that the first thing that came into my mind at this point was, if you floor it, you can beat him. Like, I'm thinking, like, I only stayed there for like a second, but I honestly did. I think, I could get off the next road. I could lose this guy. And then I thought to myself, well, hang on a minute, actually. No, he's already got my number plates. He is going to catch up with me sooner or later. It's probably going to be safer if it was sooner rather than later. Okay? And so I pulled over, and yeah, I did get a ticket and everything else. But actually, sometimes, in life, when we don't like something or we don't like the thought of something, we just kind of hope it will go away. And some people kind of do that with God. It's like, well, I don't really like the idea that maybe there will be a judgment one day and that there is a God that I'll face one day, and so I'll just kind of hope that it doesn't happen. Can I suggest that's probably a bad idea? Because Jesus' resurrection says that is going to happen one day, and it is going to affect all of us. Now, if that's kind of somber, the second point is actually really encouraging, and that is, not only is the future certain, but if Jesus rose from the dead, the past can be forgiven. The past can be forgiven. See, actually, for every single one of us, the idea of standing before Jesus as the judge should be really scary, because you know what? There's stuff in all of our lives that isn't what it should be. And actually, if God was going to be perfectly fair and perfectly just, then there's a big problem there. But the great news is that when Jesus died on the cross, he died to take the consequences of all of that stuff, all of that wrong in our lives that we've done. He was dying so that all of the debt that our wrong has accumulated could be paid for. He was dying so that we could have this fresh start. And he was dying so that one day we don't need to fear God's judgment, because we know that Jesus has already dealt with it. And then Jesus' resurrection from the dead was like the proof that that actually happened. It's a bit like when you go shopping, with your credit card, and you're kind of worried because you're thinking, like, is it going to work? At least I sometimes do. And you have to wait, don't you, for that receipt to come to prove that it's been paid, because there's that nervous moment where it might say, like, void. And sometimes it does for me. And in the same way, when Jesus died on the cross, it was like the payment was being made, but the resurrection is like the statement, the receipt that says, accepted, paid. And so actually, if you follow Jesus, you don't need to fear what's going to happen in the future, because you know Jesus has dealt with it. You know that everything's forgiven. You know that you're accepted by God. And can I say that's really amazing to know that. I got a friend who lives in the former Yugoslavia. He fought in the war just a number of years ago there. And in the war, he was responsible for the deaths of many, many people. So much so that after the war, he just struggled with this sense of guilt for what he had done. He couldn't sleep at night. His life spiraled out of control. And then he told me one day he was really struggling with this, and a group came to his town from another city. From Romania, the neighbouring country. And they came, and there was this particular girl that was quite attractive, I believe, but also she was quite joyful. And he thought, what is it about her that is so different? And he got talking, and she shared about how that she was a Christian, and he talked about his past, and she shared about Jesus and how in Jesus he could have real forgiveness and have a completely fresh start. And so he put his trust in Jesus. And he said this, he said, when I did, my guilt melted away like the snow in the springtime. And then he said, when he went to bed that night, he slept for the first night in years. It was gone. Forgiveness. And then I said to him, what happened to the girl? He said, I married her. Wouldn't you? But here's the point. Most of us haven't been involved in stuff like that. But all of us, if we're really honest with ourselves, have stuff in our lives that's wrong. And the great news is, in Jesus, we can have a fresh start. Because he rose from the dead. Here's the third reason why it matters. If the resurrection of Jesus happened, today matters too. You see, at the beginning we said, if death is the end, what's the point of everything we do in life? And most philosophers who hold to that opinion ultimately have come to the conclusion that there is no point to everything we do in life. But if Jesus rose from the dead, things are different. You see, if Jesus rose from the dead, then there's hope for this world. There's hope for these bodies. The Christian future is a physical future of resurrection. And that means that everything matters. Christians don't just go along saying, well, I know where I'm going when I die, but they live life with a greater sense of fulfillment and meaning and significance because they know that it really does count. I mean, not just going to church on Sundays, but everything we do. Our friendships and our families, our achievements and our successes, sport and art and the environment and culture and everything. Literally everything matters because the Christian claim is that it's not all going to end and it's not all going to be destroyed. We can be part of something that's going to last forever. That totally changes your view of life now. And then finally, if Jesus rose from the dead, there's hope. There's hope. A few years ago, when I was just about to go away to university to study for the first time, I got to know a couple. They were a bit older than me. He was called Barry, his wife was called Paula, and they had a couple of kids. We worked together over the course of the summer, and then I went away to a different country, well, to Scotland to study. And whilst I was there, I received news that Barry's wife, Paula, had been diagnosed with cancer. And she went for chemotherapy and treatments. But eventually, they gave her the sad news that actually it wasn't going to be effective and she was going to die. And she did. And no one who went to her funeral service will ever forget that day. As you can imagine, it was a very emotional occasion. There was her husband, her children, her parents, her friends, her family, and half the village packed into this little chapel in the village where they lived. And then into the chapel, they brought the coffin. And as they brought the coffin into the chapel, they played a song over the speaker system. And everybody suddenly sat up and listened. Do you know why? Because the woman who was singing that song was Paula, the woman who was now in the coffin. And in fact, she had sung it just a few weeks before, knowing that her death was very close. And she had particularly requested that they play it on this occasion. And the last verse of that song contains these words: "No guilt in life, no fear in death. This is the power of Christ in me. From life's first cry to final breath, Jesus commands my destiny. No power of hell, no scheme of man could ever pluck me from his hand. Till he returns or calls me home, here in the power of Christ I'll stand." You see, Paula could sing those words because she knew that Jesus was alive. And she knew where she was going. And she had absolute certainty about it. And look, we can trivialize Christianity and say, well, it's not really relevant. But can I say, look, in a world where every single one of us will face that, it is massively relevant. And Jesus says he's not just got the answer, he is the answer. Do you know that? Look, I'm nearly done. But let me ask you the question. What's your kind of reaction going to be to what you've heard tonight, or for those that have been here over 3 nights to the week's events? I guess there's three responses you could make. The first response is to say, thank you, but no thank you. Been interesting, I've enjoyed it, but I don't think this is true, and I'm not going to pursue this any further. And that's totally okay for you to do that, if that's what you want to do. We're not forcing anyone to do anything here tonight. You can make your decision. But can I also say, before you reject this, make sure you really have checked it out. And if you're going to reject this as rubbish, can I throw out a challenge? Can you think of a better explanation for the evidence of history than the resurrection of Jesus? And have you got a better answer that will make sense of death and life than what he offers? Secondly, you might be here tonight and you're saying, well, this is really interesting. This is maybe the first time I've really thought about this as an adult. And I kind of want to think about this more. And the great thing is you can do that. In fact, next Thursday, there's going to be a course that is kind of taking these ideas and giving you an opportunity to look into it more. We'll tell you about kind of the details at the end. But can I really encourage you to check that out? I mean, if there was a chance that what I've said tonight is true, please, this is worth looking into. And there's more than just a chance. But I reckon there's some other people here tonight, and you're saying, actually, I think this might be true, but what could I do about it? I want to finish just with some words. They're actually words of Jesus, and they're recorded in the very final book of the Bible, a book called Revelation. And these words of Jesus are these. He said, here I am. I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with that person, and they with me. So the risen Jesus is saying, I'm standing at the door and I'm knocking, not a physical door, obviously, but the metaphorical door of our lives, of our hearts. And he says he's knocking. Why? Because he's on the outside, waiting to be let in. And he's knocking because actually Jesus doesn't force his way into anyone's life. He knocks, but actually we have the opportunity and the choice as to whether we're going to open that door or keep it closed. It's our decision. And my question to you is, where is Jesus in your life? Is he on the outside? Is the door still closed? Or have you opened it up? And if you haven't done, can I say, what is keeping that door shut? What are the bolts that are keeping that door to Jesus shut? And I reckon there's probably two. One of them could be the bolt of doubts. You're saying tonight, well, I'm just not 100% certain this is true. Like, I'm weighing it up. And that's okay. Doubt is not the opposite of faith. And doubt doesn't need to stop you from getting started. You can trust Jesus and come with your doubts and be honest about them. That's fine. But can I also say this? Look, if you wait till you're 100% certain before you become a Christian, you never will be. Do you know why? Because actually, if you wait for 100% certainty for anything in life, you'll never do it. Like we said yesterday, proof is not found in anywhere apart from pure mathematics. And in most things in life, other than that, we have to go on the weight of the evidence. Think of a scale from 0 to 100, okay? 0 is you think this is rubbish. 100, you're convinced absolutely it's true. At what point should you make that step of putting your trust in Jesus? I don't think it's when you get to 100. I think actually it's when you get past 50. Because then it's a smaller step to accept it than it would be to reject it. So don't let doubt put you off. I think this does stand up to questioning. And hopefully you've seen this week that this is objectively true and something you can investigate. But the other doubt you might have is the doubt of the bolt of fear. And that is you're saying, well, actually, if I really got serious about Jesus, for a start, how would that change my life? And my answer to that question is, I don't know. Because actually, being a Christian, following Jesus, is about having a relationship with God. And no one knows how a relationship is going to change their lives completely before they start it. I guarantee you it won't always be easy, but I can assure you it will always be worth it. Maybe for some people, the fear is actually, what would other people think? If you kind of got serious about all this Jesus stuff. Now, for some people, for most of us in the Western world, that's more a kind of fear of like, I'm just not going to be very cool, right? And actually what I want to say is, look, if Jesus is alive and if he rose from the dead, it doesn't matter whether it's cool or not, it's true, so follow it. For some people, actually, for some of you maybe, actually it's bigger than that, because you know that if you actually started getting serious about this, there could be some big consequences. And that is the case and has been the case for many people through history. But can I say again, if it's true, it's worth following. And the cost of not following Jesus ultimately is greater than the cost of following him. And the benefits of following Jesus ultimately will outweigh anything you have to give up. Okay? It is worth it. So can I urge you not to keep the door shut? If you've not yet opened that door and said to Jesus, actually, come into my life, why not do it tonight? So what I want to do, just before we finish, we have a short break before the questions. I'm just going to finish tonight slightly differently, just with a really short prayer. Now, there's no obligation for everyone to pray this, don't worry. You could just sit and listen. But I want to pray this because I think this will be helpful for some people tonight as a way of maybe responding to what you've heard and just putting into words a response, a way of talking to God. And actually saying to God, in effect, I kind of want to open the door. I want you to come into my life. And so if you'd like to do that, no pressure, but if you'd like to do that, or maybe you realize you need to do that, then as I pray these words, maybe you could just echo them in your own heart, just silently where you sit. And if you don't want to, then by all means just listen. But I suggest what we'll do is you'll just have a few seconds just to pause, just to think in silence, just to reflect. And then after that, I will pray. And then after that, we'll have a short break. And then after that, we'll have questions, okay? But for now, let's just have a few moments of silence to reflect on what we've heard and to consider whether that door is still shut and actually if we're willing to open it. And if you'd like to, then maybe make these words your own prayer. God, I'm sorry for the way that I've often kept you on the outside of my life. Thank you that Jesus died for me so that I could be forgiven. Thank you that he's alive again and wants to come into my life. Please come into my life now and help me to live now in relationship with you from this day onwards with your help. Amen. Amen. Great. As I say, we're going to take a short break and you can do two things, or more than two things. You can obviously get up, get a drink, go to the toilets, but you could also chat to those around you and say, what do you make of that? And what questions would you like to ask off the back of it? There's the details there if you have forgotten them from earlier. And in 5 minutes or so, and we'll be back to look at a few of those questions before we go on to some music later on. Okay.
All right, Michael, we got a few questions for you.
Okay.
Thank you for everyone who asked the questions, and I'll start. If past is being forgiven, will the future be?
If the past has been forgiven, will the future be? That's a good question. And I think the answer is simply yes. It says when Jesus died on the cross, he was dealing with the consequences of all of my sins, past, present, and future. So it wasn't simply that I have a clean start and now it's kind of up to me to live perfectly in the future, because actually the news is I don't. And you just need to ask my friends, and you'll soon realize that. And the reality is you wouldn't be able to either. And so I'm always reliant upon what Jesus has done on the cross throughout my life as my basis for my confidence before God. Now, of course, some people would have a second question to that, and that is, of course, well, if Jesus has dealt with all of my wrong, past, present, and future, then I can go and do what I like, can't I? Rape, pillage, and steal, and it's all forgiven. But actually, the Bible says, if I've really understood what it cost Jesus to deal with all of that wrong, and how expensive it was for him to be able to do that, it cost him his life. The one thing I won't want to do, having realized that I've now been forgiven, is to go back into that stuff deliberately that actually ruins things in the first place. So the evidence of someone who's really come to discover Jesus and his forgiveness is not that they're perfect, because we won't be until we get to be with him, but actually there is a difference in our lives because we now want to live with him at the center, because we think that that's the best way to live. Okay?
All right, thank you. The next one, I know that you could talk a while about this, but briefly, what is your opinion on evolution and dinosaurs?
What is my opinion on evolution and dinosaurs? Wow, we could have a whole evening on that, couldn't we? It always amazes me when people come up and it's like, I get a lot of people saying, I sometimes say to people what would stop you becoming a Christian? Always amazes people when people say to me, dinosaurs. I'm like, really? That's the best reason you can think of to not become a Christian? What is my opinion on evolution? My brief answer would be that amongst Christians who love Jesus and believe the Bible, there are different opinions on this, probably in this room. Some of them would hold to a view that's different to the common assumption of science today, which is that the world isn't as old as we think it is, and that the Genesis account is to be understood quite literally as 6 days of 1 week a few thousand years ago. But there are plenty of other Bible-believing, Jesus-loving Christians who would say, actually, the way we interpret those chapters of Genesis is not explicitly literally. It's still describing God's relationship to the world, but actually that can be compatible to some degree with a much older world and the theory of evolution. It's called the idea of theistic evolution. And there are plenty of very committed Christians who would hold to that as well. So I think the bottom line is you don't have to choose. And if you're thinking, well, this is a reason why I can't become a Christian, well, don't, because, my friend who's one of the leading research scientists at the University of Southampton back home is also a leading evolutionary biologist, and he is a committed Christian. So, you don't have to decide on that one. There's all sorts of questions you might want to ask about how that works, and happily chat about that or talk to someone else about that if you want. That's a conversation to have, but don't use that as a barrier to stop you getting serious about Jesus. It doesn't have to be.
Thank you. Do you think everyone has a right to go to heaven? What about gay people?
Does everyone have the right to go to heaven, and what about gay people? Wow, big question. Let me tackle actually the first part. Does everyone have the right to go to heaven? No. No, gay people don't, straight people don't, no one does. Actually, that's the claim of the Bible, that none of us actually have a right to. If we're talking about rights, if we're talking about what we deserve, then none of us do, because what the Bible says is, if heaven is perfect and God is perfect, and in many ways we're not, then we can't claim our rights. The wonderful thing is that the Bible doesn't say God will offer us heaven as some kind of reward for what we've done or a right that we can claim, but he offers it as a gift that we don't deserve. So actually, in spite of the fact that in all sorts of ways we can spend our lives saying to God, no, keep out, God actually, thankfully, doesn't say that back to us. He says, actually, you're still welcome. And I want to offer you my forgiveness. And do gay people have that right? Or maybe let's redress that in view of the first part. Is that open to them as well? Absolutely, of course. Because the thing that stops us or cuts us off from God is not our sexual orientation, whether we're straight or gay. Actually, ultimately, is something more fundamental than that. And we can make that too big an issue. Now, does the Bible have stuff to say about marriage and sexuality and stuff on that? Absolutely. And Jesus does too. We can't get around that. But again, don't make that the issue of whether I'm going to become a Christian or not. The first thing to say is it true? Did Jesus rise from the dead? If he didn't, doesn't matter about all the rest of it. It's not true anyway. If he did rise from the dead, then okay, well, I need to take seriously what Jesus says and all of this stuff. But again, that's a massive topic that we could spend a whole evening on, and probably also more helpfully talked about in conversation. So if you'd like to chat about that, I'd happily do that, and that would be probably a better context in which to do that. Okay.
And now it's my turn.
Okay, sorry. Look this way now.
So, why should we blindly believe when people during the time of Jesus were given a physical proof? Why were they given that privilege?
Yeah, good question. So why do we have to blindly believe when they were given physical proof? A very helpful answer to this question is actually in the Bible. In John's account of Jesus' life, we call it John's Gospel, there's that chapter at the end, you might be familiar with it if you've read the Bible at all, where Thomas, who's kind of like the skeptical kind of character, the disciple of Jesus, doesn't believe that Jesus is risen because he wasn't there when Jesus physically appeared. And he says, I won't believe unless I see him with my eyes, unless I put my finger in his side, where the nails and the wounds were and so on. Only then will I believe. And then amazingly, Jesus does appear to Thomas, and Thomas does believe. And he believes because he's seen. But then it says, Jesus says, more blessed are those who haven't seen and yet have believed. Now, some people pick up on that and say, what Jesus is saying is you've got to have, irrational kind of blind faith. Now, Jesus didn't say, blessed are those who believe without thinking. He said, blessed are those who believe without seeing. And there's a big difference. There are lots of things you believe in life without necessarily seeing with your eyes or witnessing yourself. You believe it on the trustworthy authority of others or evidence. And Jesus is not commending faith that's not based on evidence, just faith that's not based on personal experience or sight. And so John then adds a comment after Jesus saying, and he says, and these things are written so that you can believe. In other words, we don't physically see Jesus like Thomas did, but we do have the evidence of the New Testament and 2,000 years of Christian history to say, actually, we can put our faith quite rationally and reasonably in the resurrection of Jesus and follow him. So it's not blind faith, it's not irrational faith. It is faith, and it's also not a leap of faith. It's kind of like I'm jumping off a cliff into the dark. I'd like to say it's a step of faith. You look at the evidence, you weigh it up, you come to the different conclusions, you realize it's true, and then you say, based on all of that confidence, I can now take that step of trusting Jesus. So it's based on the evidence, but then it goes beyond. It's a bit like if you go parachute jumping. Not that I've ever done parachute jumping, but if you do, you would probably want a lot of evidence that parachute was packed by someone trustworthy, and it's there, and everything is kind of right, okay? You'd want the evidence. That's good. You'd be stupid not to look into the evidence. But faith is then jumping out of the plane. Now, it's not strong faith if you jump out of the plane, like not even checking that it's like on your back. That would just be stupid. You want to kind of use your brain. You want to do that. Christianity commends that. But faith then says there's something to do beyond that. Once you know it's true, okay, put your life behind it.
Yeah, and next, could you share some non-anecdotal proof of Jesus' existence?
Non-anecdotal proof of Jesus' existence. Okay. I'm not exactly sure what you mean by non-anecdotal proof in that sense. Partly because I'd say, number one, proof, technically speaking, as we said yesterday, is not something that you'll ever come across in history or in science or anything outside of maths. You're looking for evidence, not proof. Okay? Doesn't mean it's not true, but we're just saying you're never going to get proof. But have we got evidence? Absolutely. In fact, I'd say you'd be hard-pressed to find any serious historian in the world, in any university today, who would deny the existence of Jesus. Now, clearly, they don't all believe in the resurrection of Jesus. But again, I want to ask, on what basis do they not? And as I said at the beginning, all of those 5 pieces of evidence, I would say almost every scholar would agree on. You've got to say, well, how do I come to terms with that? What's my explanation of it going to be? They don't require you to assume that the Bible is God's words or to assume that Christianity is true beforehand. They don't. And many people would hold to those things that don't assume those things. So that's where I'd start. If you want to look into it more, the book, But Is It True, on the bookstall is helpful in that regard. It looks at it in more detail. And there's a bibliography as well that you could look at with more books to go to.
Thank you. And next question is, what to do when Christians disagree on what's wrong and what's right? And what if I think I am right, but I'm wrong and actually acting happily against God's will?
Okay, what do I do if I think I'm right and I might be wrong, but I might be wrong and I'm right? And yeah, I'd say you're just confused. Okay. As we said yesterday, there are several ways that, as Christians, we think that God can help us know what's right and wrong. One way is our conscience. Okay. It's God-given, so you don't need to read the Bible to still have some sense of what might be right or wrong. That's why you don't find anywhere in the world a culture that's completely amoral. You'll find plenty of people that are immoral, but this sense of kind of right and wrong is kind of inbuilt. But what we said is it's not a definitive or foolproof way, in that our conscience can be suppressed. We can choose to ignore it and do it long enough, actually it doesn't work in the way that it once did. So we need some kind of objective standpoint by which we can judge my feelings versus yours. And I think, as I said yesterday, there are two ways we can do that. Firstly, through a book, the Bible, God's revelation to us. But even more than that, through Jesus, God's human revelation to us, the embodiment of what life looks like and what is good. And so I'd say, actually, yeah, sometimes we will disagree. That's why I want to say, okay, let's look. What does the Bible say on this? Does it have something to say on that? And it's discuss it from that standpoint. And can I say that's actually a really good thing? Do you know why? I'll give you one example. A couple of 100 years ago in the UK, a lot of people in Britain would have thought that slavery was okay. And a lot of them would have claimed to be Christians. And actually, there was a guy called William Wilberforce who was a Christian politician who stood against slavery, and ultimately his life's work was to lead to its abolition. Now, if it was just my feelings versus your feelings, as sometimes we think morality should work, he had absolutely no basis to try and challenge the status quo of a whole society. But it was because he had a conviction that there was a deeper authority from which morality comes that he could challenge it. And he could change the common consensus of what people thought. So the common consensus of society, or your feelings versus mine, are always going to be a shaky foundation, aren't they? But if there is an objective foundation, that's a really good place to turn to.
Okay, then we'll come to our last question.
Okay.
And it is that if you do not believe in anything bigger in life, how can you start believing in it?
If you don't believe in anything in life, how can you start believing in it? That's a really good question. And if that's where you're at tonight, can I say it's great that you're here, because we're really encouraged that you're coming and thinking about this stuff. It's really worth thinking about. As I said in the talk, it's not uncommon, in fact, it's completely normal for us to have assumptions about life. If you live in some parts of the world, your assumption is probably almost certainly that there is a spiritual realm, that there might be a God, and therefore the idea of something supernatural happening, like the resurrection, isn't necessarily out of the question. If you live in this part of the world, at this point in history, actually it's probably far more common that we have a naturalistic or materialistic assumption about the world, which is there is no God and everything can be explained by natural processes, and the idea of something like the resurrection taking place will seem completely ridiculous. Now, all of us start from a start point. We can't help that. It's just the place that we're born, the environment we live in, the culture we're brought up in, and so on. But what we can do is have the open-mindedness to question our assumptions and then potentially to change them based on evidence. I mean, that's basically how science develops, isn't it? People challenge long-held assumptions on the basis of new evidence. And I would say one of the ways to start to change your mind on this may be to actually look at the evidence and be open-minded enough to go where the evidence leads. The issue is, and can I just throw this out, some people say to me, well, Michael, I can't believe in Christianity. And I gently want to say, is it that you can't, or is it that you don't want to? Because there can be a difference between those two things. Is it that you've just looked at all the evidence and found it wanting? Or is it that actually, if you're really honest, that underneath the surface, actually there's implications if this is true, so you'd rather it wouldn't be? And I think that's worth thinking through. But also, why would you want to do that? If this is true, this is the best news in the world. This is news of a God who loves you, who offers you life, who offers meaning now, hope in the future. That's not too good to be true. That is good because it's true. And it's worth following, okay? Now, let me just say, I'm nearly done, so thank you very much for your patience this week and for your interest and for listening. Can I just say...